Is this working? Yeah, you hear me? Yeah. Do you hear me in the back? Who said no? Hello everyone, my name is Osama Dorias. I'm super happy to be here. I am a lead content designer at Blizzard Entertainment. Not many people know what that is. It's kind of like a mission activity designer. We do all the things that the players do. Also a game design professor at Dawson College in Montreal. I've been a professor for about 12 years now. And I'm one of the Habibis on the Habibis podcast, where we drink good Arab tea and we talk about games and life and we kind of make fun of each other a little. It's a lot of fun. You should listen to it. These are some of the other places I've worked in my career. And these are some of the games I contributed to. I have had the privilege of working on about 30 shipped games across multiple platforms and different genres. But I won't bore you with those details. This is why we're here. What I would like to do, oh, there is a mouse cursor and nobody told me. What is this? You have to, all right, that's better. So yeah, thank you all for coming. There's a lot more people here than I expected for a game jam, but I'm super happy to see you all here. What I wanted to do is talk a little bit about my career, the different things that I've accomplished, but through the lens of the context, because a lot of things actually appear to be harder or more impressive than they really are, and from a distance. And I would like to tell you about what actually happened. The other part of it is I want to tell you about all the different people who helped me throughout my career, but I don't have the time because there's so many. So I'm just going to introduce a handful. This, hopefully, with this, will derive some lessons that will help you, whoever is early in your career, with all your goals so that you can climb that mountain. And of course, I clicked the wrong button, because that happens. You can climb that mountain. Now, I have to start with some content warnings. The first is mountain puns. There are many, and they are hilarious. So I can't warn you enough. The second content warning is that it's true that at the beginning of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of my successes in the industry. But at the end, I'm actually going to talk about a lot of the difficulties and failures that I've had, because people don't usually talk about that, especially people who have had long careers. And we could learn as many valuable lessons from the failures as the successes. And as a result, we're going to go through a range of emotions. Mountain range, for those who don't get it? It's a fun, yes.
We got it.
Have I piqued your interest? I told you, I cannot warn you enough. I'm sorry. So I was born in Baghdad, Iraq. So that's Iraq for those who are not good at geography. And when I was less than 2 years old, I moved to Canada. I moved to Montreal. Whoa, there's a Canadian in the house. All right, come see me later. I lived there ever since I was about, well, very, very, very young. And as long as I remember, I've always made games. Even when I was a child, I used to make board games and card games. I remember one specific instance where the age is fuzzy because, you know, I was really young. But I asked my father to bring home an empty pizza box. And at this point, my dad was just exasperated. I keep asking for weird things, so he's like, yeah, whatever. We went, he got some pizzas, and he asked for an empty pizza box. And I took this box, and I created a pop-up board game. And I thought it was the cleverest thing because you didn't have to put away anything. You just close the lid and you're done. And if you want to play, you open it up again. Now, the game was pretty terrible, but that's not beside the point. I always loved to create things. And it wasn't just games. I drew comic books. I imagined movies. I didn't have a camera, so I couldn't film them. But I played them out like a play. I loved creating things. And eventually, this love for creation led me to create maps for different games. So I started with making maps for Duke Nukem and Heroes of Might and Magic and StarCraft, and eventually graduated to bigger games. This is a map I made called Crystal Reactor in Unreal Tournament. Now, I am both extremely proud of this map and very embarrassed by it because, of course, I'm a much better designer now, but I think that's normal. When we look at our old work before, we see, some things, I'm like, oh, okay, I knew how to do it even back then. I'm completely self-taught, but also I could do it a million times better now, but that's okay. And like I said, I drew comics and I had stories. A lot of them were lost, sadly, to a flood, so we won't go there. But I still, through all of this, if you had asked me as a child what I wanted to be, I would have never said game designer. And I'll explain why after. So this is me as a kid. I wanted to be an architect for as long as I remember. I wanted to create the spaces that people inhabit and walk in. There are parallels between game design. But architect was something I could grasp because my father was an engineer. My mom was an accountant, but my father was an engineer. So those are options that were available to me. Those are paths that I saw. And the engineer was closer, if I took the angle of architect, was closer to the creativity that I wanted to exhibit, that I hungered for. I won't bore you with the full story and the details, but at one point, I decided I didn't want to be an architect anymore. And the reason is because I started speaking to some architects, and I learned that very few of them design the buildings. Most of them do the math and figure out how big the bathrooms are. And that didn't interest me. So I gave up on this, and even though I wanted to do this my entire life, when it came to the pivotal moment where I had to choose what to study, that's when I fell out of love with this. And that was very devastating. So I spoke to my parents, and my parents asked me, what is it that I wanted to do? And I had a love for all things entertainment. So what I came up with was, I wanted to have a store and sell all these wonderful things that I loved. So I wanted to have a board game store that sold, back then we had VHS tapes for movies, but we sold those. I don't even know if half of you know what that is, but but comic books and video games and all these things that I loved. And when my father moved from Iraq to Canada, specifically in Montreal, he was a petroleum engineer. There was no petroleum in Montreal, so he became a businessman. He pivoted, and again, it's a long story that I can't go into. But what he said is, hey, let's partner up. He's going to fund the store, I'm going to run it. Because I know, he doesn't know anything about all this entertainment stuff anyway. And this, like, my eyes lit up at this idea. And I'm like, great, so I don't have to go to school, right? This is great news. And he said, no, the catch is you still have to go to university. Like, okay, so the smart thing would have been to go into business, right? But that sounded boring. So I looked at what I actually wanted to study that I didn't want to work in, and I decided to study political science. It was very fun. I have zero interest of being a politician. So I did. I studied political science, and I was having the time of my life because I was like, I don't even care if I don't do well. This is just a lot of fun. I'm just learning things, and I'm going to have my store waiting for me when it's done. But sadly, halfway through university, my parents lost their business. Again, reasons I won't go into because I have to keep the time. I'm already probably going to go over time, and they're looking at me like, please hurry up. So I'll cut it short. So after university, now that I didn't want to work as a politician, there's not many options for people who studied political science. I became a shipping agent, which again, probably nobody knows what that is. That was my first career. A shipping agent goes on ships. We meet the captains and we see to their needs. That's the part of the job I loved. And that could be anything from order food for us or take us out bowling because we have shore leave. I loved it. Then the other part was doing the customs paperwork. I did not love it. That was boring, and I couldn't last at the job for more than a year. It makes total sense now because I was recently diagnosed with ADHD, so of course I can't do the customs paperwork. But at the time, I was confused why this amazing job that I lucked into wasn't good for me. So back to square one. I didn't know what I was going to do, didn't have a path in front of me. And then it hit me. When I was really young, I actually picked up a book because I just love to create things. I picked up a book that the title was How to Make Websites in 21 Days. And I read it over a weekend and I started making websites just for the fun of it. It was like weeby stuff. Like I made things like, fan sites for different things that I loved, Street Fighter fan site or things like that initially. And then my dad was like, hey, can you make a website for my company? I'm like, yeah, sure. I was like 14 years old. He paid me peanuts, but it was fine. I was having fun with it. And eventually his friends who had like, coffee shops or restaurants or whatever, asked me to do the same. So going at it a little bit at a time, I made websites that were glorified menus or things like that. I got really good at it. and eventually even had e-commerce carts, and it actually worked, and I figured out how to make the taxes work and everything like that, and everything was completely functional. So I thought I was really bad at charging a good amount of money, but I was a kid, you know, any amount of money was fine. So I thought, hey, I could do this. I could be a freelance graphic web designer. I already know how to do it. I've done it in the past. How hard could it be? So I really enjoyed making the websites. I was still really bad at charging a fair amount and collecting the money. So unfortunately, even though I was a freelance web designer, I had to take odd jobs in between just to pay rent. So sometimes I would be work at tech support for 3 months, or customer service somewhere, whatever I had to do, even retail jobs, just to make ends meet, because I was, again, really bad at the business part. I really should have studied business. But the one thing that was really good about this is it taught me scripting, and it taught me how to use Photoshop better, which allowed me to make games. For the first time in my life, I wasn't making content for games. I was making games. And they were terrible. But I loved them, and they were mine. And I had these skills all of a sudden. So now you would think that I am here with the knowledge to make games, and the ability to make games, and the time to make games, and I'm making games. Why didn't I consider it as a career? The reason, actually, is going to be a little bit clear in a sec. Before that, there's a phenomenon that happens in the industry. I don't know if you've experienced it, but I've seen it multiple times, where game devs will come together and ask themselves the question, when did you know? The long version of that is, when did you know that you wanted to be a game dev? And more typical looking people in our industry, the age ranges between 6 and 8. Usually they got a video game console when they were young, or they went to their uncle or aunt's house and they had a game console and they tried it and they're like, this is what I want to do. For me, it came much, much, much later. Marginalized people, it often comes much, much, much later. So this is my friend, Ahmed Saad. He's of Palestinian descent. He studied history, but he had a minor in political science, so we met in school, and we used to play floor hockey together. And when he graduated with a history degree, he edited a game design book that was from a history focused, like the history of game design. And when he did that, he really impressed the authors of the book, and they gave him an internship as a game designer at a mobile studio. And when I found this out, something clicked in my head where I'm like, someone that looks like me got this job that I didn't know was the job of my dreams. Sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. I was 27 years old. Most people, 6, 8, marginalized people, much later. I still meet people, like women who are in their 50s, who are like, I've wanted to do this all the time, but I didn't see a woman in this field, or other marginalized people who just don't see it. That's why representation matters so much. I was already a game designer. I just wasn't a professional one, and I didn't see a path. Yeah, I'll take a sec, sorry. So Ahmed, he was in the industry for not that long, a few months at that time, but he helped me build a portfolio. He was my first mentor. He just took all my games that I was working and he put them in 2 piles, the good and the bad. Sadly, there was nothing in the good. But he showed me how to modify some of the games and bring them over to the good. He taught me how to write a design doc. He helped me build my portfolio over a period of what sounds like or feels like 6 months now, but it's a long time ago. I use 6 months a lot. I don't actually know how long things took, but let's say it was about 6 months. It was a long time. It felt like an eternity because I wanted to do that now, right? At that point. So after me insisting that I was ready and him telling me that I'm not, eventually at some point he's like, okay, you know what? Start applying. So I did, and I applied to 1 or 2 companies a day because I actually wanted to have the best chance possible, so I wrote each individual one a cover letter that was unique to them. And I kept broadening what do you call it? My reach, basically. So initially it was just local companies that were super close. And with time, I kept pushing it further and further and further, and I was really applying to anywhere in the world. And other than automatic messages of either rejection or we'll see, I got nothing. Not even a single reply. I was defeated. So after really for months applying to everything and working on my portfolio while working on graphic and web design and having odd jobs and killing myself trying to get into the industry at a time where you couldn't even study it, so there was no other path. Like the schools that started teaching game design started shortly after this, just to give you an idea of how old I am. I gave up. I told myself that I was going to take a break, but the honest truth is, in the moment, I didn't think I was going to go back to it. I thought, this is not for me. And then 6 months later, or some period of time, I get a call from a mobile game developer. And what they said is, hey, we saw on your CV that you listed poker as an interest. We're looking for a poker expert. And I said, I'm a poker expert. Absolutely I am. And they said, good, because we have a test in 2 days. Uh-oh. So I called in sick from work, whatever customer service job I had at the time, and I went to the bookstore and I bought 5 poker books and I didn't sleep for 2 days. This was on a Wednesday. And I didn't know what I didn't know. But the honest truth is, reading those books, I learned a lot about poker. And I had a lot of motivation to make this work. So when I showed up to the interview/test, I nailed it. I got every question right. And what was interesting is, I thought I knew poker. If I didn't study, I would have gotten every question wrong. But more importantly, I was the only one who got every question right. And so, I climbed that mountain. So I got the job. I was, I guess, the best qualified for it. I wasn't really a poker expert at the time, and of course that came with a lot of imposter syndrome, but I didn't care, I was super happy. And I ended up staying at that mobile developer for 7 years. I say it's a mobile developer because the first games I worked on were mobile phones. Again, I'm old. They were pre-smartphones. Yes, that was a thing. And yes, they had games too. But we also made other, like I made a Nintendo DS game there, a Nintendo Wii game there, a PS3 game there. Like we tried to do other things while the non-smartphone market was dying and the smartphone was picking up. We did a few things in between. And I got a lot of experience because those dev cycles were really short. And I became a generalist game designer. Every time I had an opportunity to change genres, to change expertise, I took it because that's just who I am. Again, ADHD, right? So I just, from one thing to another, I ping-ponged like crazy, and I loved it. The job wasn't perfect. There were a lot of problems, but I made it. I was happy, and I convinced myself that the problems weren't there. We'll talk about the problems later, don't worry. This is my friend Kevin. Kevin was a unicorn. He was a game designer at a period where the industry was just starting off in Montreal. Ubisoft was small, to give you an idea. This is pre-Sands of Time, Prince of Persia, like really, really the beginning. So he had experience working on some big games, and he had 10 years of experience in the industry, which now is okay. It's double what people usually have. Back then, it was unheard of. Like, it was extremely rare to have that much experience, but it was possible. And most of the people who had this in Montreal came from Ubisoft. They were the Ubisoft school. And Kevin was no exception. He had a stint where he worked at Silicon Knights on a Metal Gear, which was freaking incredible, but he also worked on a Rainbow Six, and he worked on a lot of really big titles. So he wanted to slow down, so he came to work with us at the mobile game developer. And I latched onto him because I wanted to learn everything that he knew. I went to him and I learned that he was also a game design teacher. And I wanted so badly to be a teacher. It's something I always thought that I could do. So I went up to him and I said, what does it take? How can I become a design teacher? And he said that it's really difficult because at that point, I only had about 3 years of experience. And they were looking for someone who had close to what he had, like 10 years of experience. So he's like, don't get discouraged, but it might take time. And I'll show you the ropes until then. Now, next thing I knew is that he actually came back a couple of weeks later and he's like, hey, something interesting happened. I'm like, yeah, what? What's going on? He's like, how would you like to teach sooner than that? I'm like, how soon? He's like in 3 weeks. What happened? So in the level design program at Dawson College where he was teaching, one of the teachers there, she got a job opportunity in Europe, and her class that she was supposed to be teaching in 3 weeks right now had no teacher. She worked at EA, and she used the Dragon Age engine, and Dawson has been struggling to find a teacher who knew who fit their criteria, basically. And they were getting desperate. So I smelled opportunity. What they were looking for is someone who knew the Dragon Age engine, who had 10 years of experience, and who could prepare a curriculum in 3 weeks. I had one of these things. I had 3 weeks. But I was determined. So I took some time off from work. You see the pattern. I downloaded the Dragon Age engine, and while I was interviewing for the job, I was learning what the engine is. But nobody at Dawson even knew the engine, so they couldn't even test me on it. They kind of had no choice but to hire me because I was literally the only person who applied. However, I still climbed that mountain. And I'm super happy about that. So I was the youngest teacher in the history of the program, even to this day. And that was 12 years ago. So I got the job. And the funny thing is, I was only about a week ahead of the students in knowledge, because that's all I had time to prepare anyway. So if they asked me anything that I didn't prepare, my answer, like 50% of the time was like, I don't know, I'll tell you next week. I'll look it up, I guess. But it was fine. I was sweating buckets before the first class because I was like, I'm an imposter and they're going to figure it out. And then I just decided to tell them exactly what happened. And I did. And they're like, oh, okay. And that was the end of that. And then I didn't have to pretend anymore. I'm like, oh, sorry. I just didn't prepare that yet. And they're like, okay, that's fine. After that class, I had an incredibly good evaluation from the students, and it still confuses me to this day. I started teaching other classes. I taught a game history class and all the other things. So I loved teaching, I really did. And then this gentleman, Sean Bell, who was the level design program coordinator, about 2 years after this, so I had about 5 years of experience at this point, he took me aside. He's like, hey, let's go have a coffee. I'm like, yeah. He's like, I just got another job offer. So my position is vacant and I think you could fill it. I'm like, I'm not even qualified to be a teacher. You want me to be the coordinator? He's like, so you're not interested? I'm like, hell yeah, I'm interested. Sign me up. He just thought my evaluation was really good. I had good energy and I wanted to do things and he thought I could fit the bill. The catch is, I'm a game designer. I've done level design, but that's not my specialty. So I didn't feel comfortable doing this. So what I told him is, I want a game design program and I want to be a coordinator of that. And he's like, but we don't have a game design program. I'm like, well, I could make one. How hard could it be, right? So Sean took me to the director of the entertainment program at the college. And the director had no idea what the meeting was about. And I was there, and I sit down, and I tell him, yeah, I want to create a game design program. And he looked at me, he's like, oh, so you have a background in education? I'm like, nope. He's like, what do you know about creating a program? I'm like, nothing. Like, how do you hope to accomplish this? I said, well, just show me what the level design program looks like, and I'll reverse engineer and make a game design program. How hard could it be? He sighed the longest sigh I've ever heard. Then he turned around and actually took a giant binder from behind him, which was the level design program. He handed it to me and he said, good luck. Now, while thinking about this, because I'm not a person who just takes things easy, apparently. I like to make things as difficult on myself as I possibly can. So I thought I didn't just want to create a game design program. I wanted to create an independent game design program, a multidisciplinary independent game design program. And the reason for this is because I felt that if I started this program and people started graduating, that game designers would be saturated in the city. There's not that many jobs to go around. And I wanted to give my students a foundation so that at least if they wanted to start their own companies, they would know basic scripting, basic art, basic business, and they'll be able to make their own games on their own. The problem is, in the world, at that time, there was no other independent game design program. I looked it up. I posed this challenge to multiple people. It did not exist. To this day, I don't even know if it still exists. I'm not sure. But I had nothing to fall back on. The other thing I thought is, even then, I would feel extremely guilty if my students graduated and had like student debt. And I know we're in Europe, so a lot of people don't understand this. There's a lot of debt in North America. Canada is good compared to the States, but terrible compared to here in Europe in general. So I insisted that not only will this program be an independent game design program, but that it'll be tuition free, which is a 4-letter word at Dawson College. I'm like, what can I lose? Like, right? I'm gonna pitch this anyway. I'm gonna do my best. Might as well throw all my conditions on it. And also, this is a 4-disciplinary program now, where I'm not even an expert. I'm an intermediate game designer for 5 years at that point. How am I going to even build this program? Easy. I had friends. So I assembled the Avengers. All the people that I worked with in the industry who were like-minded and wanted to partake in helping other people learn about how to make games, I brought them together and I told them, help me build this. And they did. So I did the first drafts, showed it to them, tell them what did I get wrong, how do I build this program, and through their expertise, I had my own binder now. And when I asked the director to have a meeting with him, this was 6 months later, I don't know how long, he called me in, and he's like, yeah, so what do you want? I'm like, what do you mean, what do I want? I created the program. And he looked at me, he's like, wait, what are you talking about? He did not expect to see me again. He thought he scared me off by giving me the level design program. And I handed him my binder, and he put it in front of him, and he sighed the second longest sigh I've ever seen. And he started flipping through the pages, and his facial expression changed from, let's get this over with, to, oh, I can work with this. So the work paid off. The language was all wrong, because I don't actually know what I'm doing. So all he had to do was assign me a technical writer from the school who helped me translate the program into a language that academics could understand. That took about 3 weeks, because all the work was there. So I sat with her, and she was wonderful, and she's like, you used all these wrong words, find and replace, and we'll go over it. Didn't even take that long. And I had a program. Now the hard part. I had to pitch it to the Ministry of Education. Nothing in my life was scarier than this. I didn't even know how to prepare for this. The only thing I could think of is I took a notebook and I wrote as many questions as possible that I thought that they would ask me. And on the other side, I wrote whatever answers I thought were good. But I had no way to measure this or to know what they wanted. I so over-prepared for this meeting because I showed up and their questions were like, what is game? They weren't testing me to know if I knew what I was talking about. They wanted to learn what the hell it was that I was doing. Like, I think the hardest question to ask me is, you mentioned engine, what is that? When they were done with those questions, I actually was confused. I'm like, okay, when are the hard questions coming? The ones I practiced for. They never came. And I climbed that mountain. So I walked you through the process. It wasn't unreasonable to think that this process was something unattainable for someone with my experience, right? However, some mountains are really hills in disguise. Sometimes we defeat ourselves before we even try. And of course, there are risks and there are other considerations that to take into place. But if at the end, if there's something you really want to do, and failure doesn't really amount to anything. For me, it would have been 6 months of lost time. And honestly, I didn't expect to succeed. I swear to God, I thought I was going to fail the first time. Design is iterative. I thought I was going to go back to the drawing board multiple times until I get it right. I was just as shocked as everyone else when it passed on the first time. That was not part of the plan at all. But it worked. And the task was really much easier, much easier. It was a lot of work, but difficulty was much easier than I ever would have imagined from the beginning. So this is my friend Selim. I love this guy, I really do. Selim worked with me at that mobile game company. Selim and I had the same dream. Our dream was we were gonna work in the gaming industry for a bit, and then we're gonna start our own studios, independent studios, so we could make the games we really wanna make. I couldn't follow up with that. We'll talk about that later. Selim did. He left the company and he worked on this game called The Girl and the Robot. And it's a sweet game about a relationship, a friendship between a robot, a giant robot, and this little girl who was stuck in a tower. It's beautiful. I would recommend that you play it. And so Selim was one of the relatively few indie developers at the time in Montreal. And I was working, coordinating an independent game design program. And he was my friend. So I reached out to him and I said, I want to know what your struggles are so that I could prepare my students as much as possible. And obviously one of the biggest struggles is money. It's like, even though he released his game, finances weren't great. So I offered him a job teaching in my program. That's him right there. That's one of our classrooms. And it worked out perfectly because now the students can directly ask him the questions of the life he's living in that moment. And he was multidisciplinary. He actually knew, like he was a solo dev. He did everything himself. So he would be able to answer all the questions that I couldn't. I was a poser. And it worked out really well. And I kept doing that. I kept going to him and I'm like, what are your struggles now? What are your struggles now? How can we address them for the students? One of the struggles I didn't expect. He said Montreal was very strange. At this point, he had been teaching for a few years. We had a lot of indie studios. So when he started, there were not that many. But at this point, there were a lot of indie game studios. And we didn't have any festivals for them. We didn't have the Montreal Awards Festival. We didn't have a PAX. We didn't have anything like that. All our devs were traveling to Los Angeles. They were traveling to Boston, to Japan, everywhere else in the world, except locally. I'm like, and there's no visibility there. And there were legion. There were so many of us. Why is it that we didn't have a place of our own in Montreal? So I had this ridiculous idea that I was going to create a pitch deck for a festival and go to all the game organizations and tell them, you should do this. I thought it was brilliant because I could convince them to do the work that my students needed. Obviously, it was a ridiculous idea and nobody listened to me. Like, who are you to tell us what to do? In retrospect, that made sense. But then I had an even more ridiculous idea. I spoke to Selim and I said, why don't we do that? Why don't we just start our own festival? How hard can it be? We have access to Dawson. We have big rooms. We have electricity. What else do you need? So obviously, we had no idea what we were doing. But you would imagine that we at least reached out to people who did know what they were doing and enlisted them on our teams, right? No. But at least we reached out to people who did something and asked them about some of the problems that they face so that we don't repeat the same mistakes that they did before. That's a bare minimum, right? No. We just jumped straight in. We're like, let's book a room. We have no budget for marketing. We have 20 tables that we could set up. We'll invite indies. Whatever happens, happens. Let's figure it out. So we found the multidisciplinary room in Dawson, whose capacity was about 200 people. It was a beautiful room, and we didn't think we could we didn't think we would be able to bring 200 people. Zero marketing budget, none at all. And so I was like, that's fine. We'll tell the indies that this is, a pilot, and they just invite their friends, and everyone's friends of the indies will see each other's games, and that's how we're gonna start off, and eventually we're gonna build to something bigger. And they thought it was a good idea. They signed up. Actually, too many of them signed up. We had 20 tables, and we had like over 60 applicants. So we split the tables in half, and we told each person, each studio, that they had half a table, and we invited 40. And we ended up having 900 people show up to our first iteration of the festival. The indies were really happy. The college was not. We broke a lot of fire code regulations that day. There was no room to walk around. But the Montreal Independent Games Festival was born on a shoestrap budget. And what I mean by that is Sauropod paid for our awards, the trophies, and no other money was spent. We just booked the room. I wrote my name and I'm like, this room is mine now. Dawson, you're paying for the electricity, let's go. It worked. And we had a second iteration. And the second iteration we were like, okay, we're gonna be prepared now. We're gonna book a room that has a capacity of 1,000 people. And we got 2,000 people. Then the third iteration happened, and we booked a room with a capacity of 2,000 people, and we had 5,000 people, and we're like, oh my God, what do we do? However, what's important here is I climbed that mountain. So a new festival started up. You know that company, that organization I went to and I said, you should start a festival? And they said, who are you? Well, they decided to start a festival after seeing our festival. And I talked to Selim at the time because I told him, listen, we were working on our games. Like in my case, I was working for a company. For his case, he was working on his indie game. I was a coordinator of the program. He was teaching 2 classes and I was teaching a class. And the festival is bigger than it's ever been. We don't have time to do this part-time anymore. So I told him, how about we just give up and tell them they could have the festival. We'll just share whatever. We didn't want to do it to begin with. Our original plan was to convince someone else to do it. So we did that in the hardest possible way, but we did it. Why don't we just like put our arms up and say, you win? So we called a meeting with them. They had no idea why we were calling the meeting. So they were on edge. They're like, oh, the competition wants to talk to us. And we were like, you do the festival, we'll do the award ceremony at your festival. Deal? You should have seen the look of confusion on their face. So this is not our festival. Mega is a festival that was run by La Guilde, which is an association in Montreal for indie devs, which really should have started the festival to begin with, but didn't. This is recorded, crap. I'm gonna get in trouble for this. And this is my friend Salim, who I mentioned before. So we had a different role now. And we continued this, and the festival kept growing and growing until COVID hit, and they took a time off, and it's back now. But I have since, for reasons you'll see later, stepped down. I'm on the advisory board. I am no longer the co-director of the awards for reasons that will be obvious in not too long. But I had to make a choice. I can't do all the things. You can't climb all the mountains as much as you want to, and I really wanted to. So this is a person who I will not name, for good reasons, don't worry. Let's rewind to the second iteration of our festival. There was this person who I knew, who was the head of arguably the biggest indie studio in Montreal, who showed up to our festival, who I recognized because he's an important person in our industry, but who didn't know who I was. He walks in and he's looking around super confused. I'm like, what's so confusing? It's going well. We're like at double capacity. Maybe that's why. He beelines to some exhibitors and asks them some questions. And after a while, they point at me and he walks over to me and he says, are you the organizer of this festival? And I said, yeah, me and my friend said him. He said, I didn't pay to get in. I'm like, yeah, it's free for exhibitors. Oh, sorry, it's free for attendees. And then he said, but I spoke to the exhibitors and they didn't pay either. I'm like, yeah, it's free for exhibitors. He's like, how do you make any money? I said, that's easy, we don't. And he said something that in the moment shocked me. He said, show me. So I did. I had nothing to hide. I pulled out my phone. I went to my Google Sheets that had all my finances. And I showed him that we were a few $100s in the red. This was the second iteration. The first one, we weren't. The second, we upped it a bit. He's like, who's going to pay for this? I'm like, oh, we're going to split it, me and Salim. We're fine. And he said, I want to sponsor your event. I'm like, dude, it's almost over. What do you want to get out of this? And then he said, under one condition. I'm like, there it comes. He said, I'm going to write you a check for an amount, and whatever is extra, you split with your partner. And I want nothing in return. And that was beautiful. This person became an ally for us. And every time there was any kind of organization, any kind of meeting of indie devs, he would always bring us up, saying that we wanted to give something back to the community, and we were looking for nothing in return. And allies are important. So I only don't mention his name because he did that anonymously. I would love to mention his name. Now, I want to remind you all that my dream, the ridiculous dream when I got into the industry, was to work in games for a year, learn everything there is to know about making games, and start my own studio. After about a week, I'm like, uh-oh, that's not going to work. But I tried multiple times, and we'll go into that. One of the times in particular almost succeeded, but enough that I will count it. With a small team, one programmer, one artist, and a few contractors, we made this game. It's called Heroes Never Lose. It was an action puzzler. We released it, we did a Kickstarter. It was a very modest Kickstarter, but it succeeded. We released it on early access on Steam. People can play it now. The online works. It's fun. It got good reviews. And unfortunately, it didn't make enough money to start our own studio. It just barely broke even. But still, I made an indie game. I climbed that mountain, right? So the short version of this part is that I left the mobile company because they didn't allow you to work on your side projects in order to work on this project. Well, the project that was on the previous slide. And I found the only company in Montreal at the time that allowed us to work on our own projects, which was a company where you make games for, it's like airplane games, but not flight simulators. You know, like when you're on an airplane and this annoying person is like poking you on the back of your seat? Yeah, those airplane games. It's my fault, I'm sorry. I did that for a couple of years because basically their terms is that I can work on any game as long as I don't release it on airplanes. So it's super easy for me to comply. The problem with that is it was a very niche market and my expertise was becoming narrower. The longer I stayed there, the more I saw the writing on the wall that this, people are bringing phones on their planes. They're not playing these games as much. So I felt that I had to move on, even though actually that was my favorite job I've had in the industry, to be honest, because it wasn't a game company. It was a tech company that treated you well, that allowed you to make games, that went into a catalog next year. So there was no stress. It was super fun. The dev cycles are small. I got to work on like 5 games at a time. It was a dream job, but the writing was on the wall and I had to jump ship. And the problem is we have a very big problem in our industry. There's gatekeeping all across the board. And I realized at that point that I had mobile experience that was getting old and I had this in-flight entertainment experience that nobody cared about. I needed to get AAA experience. I was a lead at that point at the company. I went from junior to senior to lead, but AAA would not consider me a lead. They just did not, the gatekeeping was harsh. And so I decided that that's fine. I'll take what they could give me. I'll get that experience so I can give nobody else an excuse in the future and I could do whatever job I need to do. I'm sad that I had to do this. I wish this wasn't the case. I'm not saying this is okay, but this is what I felt I had to do, to be clear. So I stepped down and they offered me an intermediate game design position. Very shortly afterward, they gave me a promotion and they put people under me as part of a team and I climbed back up. So I had the skills, I had the knowledge, I just had to prove it. But the gatekeeping is really heavy in our industry and we have to do something about it. The other thing I want to talk about is I am a Muslim in the gaming industry. 15 years ago, I was a unicorn. There were less than a handful of us in Montreal. I don't know how many in the industry, I didn't speak to anyone else outside of Montreal in my junior years, but there were very, very few of us. And I had to develop very thick skin because I had to deal with a lot of microaggressions before I even knew what the word was. And so I laughed along with a lot of things I shouldn't have laughed along. But it's a defense mechanism. I'm still trying to unlearn that. I still sometimes someone says something uncomfortable and I laugh and I catch myself and I'm like, no, that was not appropriate. And I sound like I don't want to use the term crazy, but inconsistent at least. But as I started becoming more senior in the industry, I started to speak up more. And at one point, I really felt like it didn't come from a bad place. It was a place of ignorance, and I wanted to teach people better. So I created this presentation about, it's like a how-to guide of Muslim representation in games. I felt that was very important. And I started pitching it to every conference that I could think of. Of course, I started with GDC because I aim high, but they didn't say yes for years and years, and I gave up, and I started pitching it to anyone else I could. And the first chance I got was from a conference that was organized by another marginalized group, DMG Camp, Dames Making Games, which was a group of people from marginalized genders who have their own conference. And obviously, they were the first people to give me a chance on a platform. And I'm indebted to them. This was the first talk that I ever gave outside of Montreal. And it was a very important talk that I held very dear to me. The other thing that was really important about this is they recorded the talk. So now I had a link that I could send to people to assure them. Nobody knew who I was outside of Montreal. So if I wanted to speak about this, they were just afraid of what I would say. So I would just send them the link and be like, just watch this. You'll see. It's fine. I don't bite. And all of a sudden, it opened up all the doors. Like years and years and years of rejections. And then I get one talk, and then week after week, I'm getting invitations everywhere to give this talk. It was night and day. So when I say I'm indebted to them, I'm not kidding. And eventually, and by eventually, I mean literally the next year, GDC accepted the talk. And I gave the how-to guide to Muslim representation talk. That year, when there were 430 other talks, my talk was ranked second. I'm very proud of it. And to this day, people still share it and reach out and thank me for it. And I'm super happy that it has a positive impact. But I would like to rewind a little bit. This was not my first GDC. But my first 9 years in the industry, I did not go to GDC. GDC, there's a lot of privilege. Oh no, I have to hurry up. I got the 15-minute warning. Okay, I'll speak faster. This is my friend, Raina Anderson. Raina was a narrative designer at the mobile studio. She was one of my first mentors. I actually was multidisciplinary. I did narrative design for a while, and she taught me how. She came to me and she said, Osama, there's this program. It's called Amplifying New Voices. You should apply to it. Then you'll get a chance to go to GDC and expand your network. Unfortunately, going to GDC is a big privilege. It's not necessary for your careers, I admit that, but it does help, and it's unfortunate that so many people are cut out from it. I, honest to God, didn't believe that I'd ever go. I didn't even have it as a goal. I was pitching as a long shot. As you can see, I take a lot of long shots. So, when I say this, you could believe me. I was like, whatever, maybe. So I didn't believe I could go, and I didn't feel confident. I felt my imposter syndrome was so heavy that I didn't actually feel confident that I would be able to get this talk, get this sponsorship and go to GDC. But she insisted, and she said, no, you're gonna do this. So I did. I signed up, and I got that scholarship, and I ended up going to GDC for the first time in 2017. So, oh, I went the wrong way again, sorry. Every time I take my finger off it. This is me in 2017 at GDC. Look at that smile, that's genuine. I was in heaven. This is 2018 when I delivered my how-to guide to Muslim representation in Games Talk. This is 2019 where I was on my first panel with other industry legends. That's Raf Koster. He wrote A Theory of Fun, my favorite game design book. I couldn't believe I was sitting next to him. I fanboyed over him so hard. In 2020, I was asked to give the keynote at GDC. But you know what happened in 2020. But I still delivered it in 2021 remotely, and I'm still counting that, all right? Also in 2021, I joined the GDC advisory board. They're like, hey, you give good talks. Maybe you could teach others how to do it. I'm like, yeah, sure, man. And in 2022, I hosted the Game Developers Choice Awards. So I climbed that mountain. Now, this was the peak of the presentation. This is what I'm talking about, the successes, but giving you context. So you see that it's not magic. I had a lot of help along the way. You'll understand more like what was possible, what wasn't possible, and what happened. But it's all downhill from here. Now I'm gonna talk about some heavy subjects. So if you are triggered by any of this, I apologize. Please take care of your own mental health, walk out. No one's gonna judge you. We're actually gonna judge you positively for taking care of yourselves. Last time I gave this, I cried. I will try my best not to, but it's kind of heavy. So I have to remind y'all that all of this almost never happened. I gave up. I was applying for months and I was hearing nobody back. And if it wasn't for that call from the mobile developers, I don't know if I would have even been a professional game designer, because I was already a game designer. I was making games since I was a kid, but I don't know if I've ever would have continued that path. So all this is to say that there is a lot of luck involved in this. You don't have to take rejection as a fault of your own. Sometimes you need a chance and sometimes you don't get that chance. So try to enjoy your journey regardless of the outcome as much as possible. It's the only way to be happy. When I first became a game designer, I told you my initial plans were to start my own studio. I am now a 15-year dev with 15 years of experience and no studio. Not a lot of people talk about their unrealized goals, but all of us have it. So everyone who has some level of success, you would think, oh, they got everything they want. That's just not reality. And it's okay not to get everything that you want. Again, try to enjoy the journey. About 3 years into my time at the mobile game developer, I asked my boss at the time if I could speak to him because I needed to tell him something important. So we went to lunch together and he told me, all right, which is it? Are you changing jobs or is your wife pregnant? It was neither of those things. I wanted to apologize because I lied to him, because I was not a poker expert. And he laughed and called me an idiot. And he said he never wanted to hire a poker expert. He asked me, how many poker games did you work on? And how many games did you work on after that? What he wanted is somebody who can have the potential to become a poker expert so that they could work on a poker game. That's what he was looking for. And I carried that with me, and it gave me so much imposter syndrome that when I first started working at that job, I never asked for help. I lied all the time. Do you need help learning how to do this flowchart? No, I got it. I did not got it. I would stay 16-hour days, 7 days a week to try to get it because I didn't want to be found out. That is unhealthy. Don't do this. What ended up happening at one point, there was a project that was so difficult that I was working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 or 4 months straight, that when that project shipped, I went home and I sat on the couch and I looked at the TV. I was watching TV. My wife comes in and she says, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine. Why?" She's like, "The TV's off." I was broken. I didn't even realize. All this because I had imposter syndrome and I didn't want to be found out. When, if I knew what I know now, juniors shouldn't have that kind of pressure on them. So obviously this caused my first burnout. It was terrible. Like that much work, I didn't have friends anymore. Like I kind of had friends that were in the past and I didn't watch TV shows, I didn't play games, I didn't have a life outside of work. And my wife forced me to take time to recover. I couldn't because I was afraid of being found out as an imposter. So I just went back to work and toughed it out. Told you that I had my program coordinator job, right? Did I also tell you that I was the only person who did that job part-time? That was a full-time job. A handful of coordinators taught one class in addition to that. I had a full-time demanding job. I did the coordinator job, and sometimes I taught 2 classes at the same time. And that wasn't even the end of it. We'll get there. When I stepped down as coordinator, because I had to, and we'll explain why, my friend Carmack picked it up because he wanted to go indie. And he's like, "Oh, this is great. You did it part-time, and then you had all these other things, so I could definitely make a game and do this part-time too." He could not. It was too demanding. So they replaced me with 2 people. My friend Elaine also became co-coordinator of that program. I did an impossible amount of work consistently, and I was coordinator for 8 years. It's like to this day, I don't know how I did it, but I did it. Now, rewind to the second iteration of the festival that I ran. As I mentioned, we were very good about asking other people how to run a festival by absolutely not doing it at all and figuring it out on our own. What I didn't mention is that about 30 minutes before the doors opened, we lost power in half the festival because we didn't know that we had to limit people's power consumptions because you don't know what you don't know. So people were bringing PlayStations and Xboxes and all their computers and all their monitors because we didn't tell them that there was a limit because we didn't know that there was a limit. And now 30 minutes and the doors are going to open and I went into panic mode. Running around, rerouting, fuses, whatever. We finally got it up and running 15 minutes after the doors opened. And now if I ask people who attended the festival, I'm like, "Do you remember when the power went out?" Most say no. Some are like, "Oh yeah." I couldn't sleep for 2 weeks after that. I kept waking up with nightmares that there was like headlines in newspapers where festival without electricity, games could not be played. Which, no newspaper wrote about us, so that didn't really, there's no chance of that happening, but still. Now, I mentioned that I had a full-time demanding job that I often did overtime with, and that I was coordinator of the video game programs, and that sometimes I taught 1 or 2 classes, and that I also ran a Kickstarter for my own indie game, and that I also shipped that game, and I also ran a festival. And I didn't mention, no joke, a dozen other things, because I was also the chair of the Muslims in Games Special Interest Group. I was one of the co-founders of Gameloft. I mentored a whole bunch of people. I ran a lot of workshops and game jams. But what I didn't mention is I did this all at the same time. There was one period in my life where all of these things were active at the same time. And I was barely sleeping. So people would ask me, "You work a lot. Do you ever rest?" I got you. And the answer is no, I never did. Even when I went on vacation, I brought my laptop with me. And I woke up in the middle of the night because I remembered a thing that was due the next day that I didn't finish. I was present for my family, but not really present for my family. I'm very ashamed of it. And when I shipped that game, the indie game specifically, after that Kickstarter, I had a terrible burnout. And my biggest shame of my career is that that game is on early access still. I delivered all the main goals, but I did not deliver the stretch goals. And to this day, I could do anything else, but as soon as I sit down to work on that game, I get drained of energy. I can't. The trauma from that burnout is heavy. So I issued a lot of refunds to anybody who complained. The game is functional, there are no stretch goals, and I still have it as a plan to one day go back to it. But it's been 7, 8 years, and I'm not any closer to working on that game. I cannot even explain it. Burnout is weird, and each burnout is worse than the one before. But that was a failed attempt to start a studio, a semi-successful one to make an indie game. But there were 3 other serious attempts to start a studio that I didn't even tell you about that all failed, where I built teams and I sought funding, and none of them worked out. And nobody talks about these failures. You only see the success at the end. If it ever happens one day, you're like, oh, Osama, start your studio, great. Yeah, how many attempts did it take? How many other people are succeeding, but they're failing so many times before they get there, and they're not talking about it? In 2019, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it was a very difficult time. I mentioned that I had to drop a lot of things. This was the reason. I switched from working 5 or more days to working 4 days a week, and I took care of her the other 3. We took turns with my siblings. It was obviously a very difficult time for her, but it was also a very difficult time for me and for my family. And thankfully, she went into remission 2 weeks before COVID hit. And at the thought of a lockdown, I had a panic attack because I was just going through a lockdown. I had cut out literally everything that gave me joy. I wasn't teaching anymore. I wasn't working on side projects. I wasn't doing everything was gone. It was work and my mom. And all of a sudden, we're in lockdown now. And I'm an extreme extrovert. Like, even my extroverted friends are shocked how extroverted I am. This was a miserable time. It was a very difficult time. We have a spacious, 3-bedroom apartment. We felt it was spacious before COVID hit. I have 3 kids. All of a sudden it felt too small because now I had to homeschool 2 of them. One was old enough to not need it. And I had to work out of my bedroom because I had no dedicated office. And as a result, I got insomnia, I started getting migraines, and I can tell you my symptoms till the cows come home. Is that the expression? I don't know. It was a really terrible time, which I can't go into because I'm running out of time. But if you want, I gave a GDC talk about it that just went live yesterday on the Vault that doesn't require login, so you could watch the full story. And yeah, it's a very emotional, difficult talk. But this led me to have my burnout. The 3rd burnout. And each burnout is worse than the one before. And long story short, I couldn't design. I couldn't solve problems. I couldn't be creative. It just left me. I just had none left. There was no juice. You were squeezing, nothing came out. And I went on sick leave, and I came back, and I went again, and I couldn't figure it out, and it was devastating. And then finally, I decided, you know what, I need to leave. I can't do this anymore. It's not working. So I looked for a job that didn't have any creative impact at all. These are my friends, Tally and Charlotte. They work at Unity. They worked with me at one indie studio that I worked at a long time ago. So they knew about my work ethic. They knew about my character. They knew who I was. And I went to them broken. And I told them, I can't. I'm sorry. I told them that I just couldn't do anything. And they said, come, we have a job for you. Like, what could you possibly give me as a job? I can't work. And they told me that, Osama, 1/5 of what you do is more than most people. Just come. Don't worry about it. And they lived up to their promise. They hired me as a senior partner relations manager, which is not a design job. I did that for 9 months last year. I still don't know what the job is. But it was a good job. It just didn't have the creative part, but I couldn't do that part anyway. And they had the understanding. They're like, come, we'll take you. You stay as long as you want. After a few weeks, they told me, you're doing a good job. After a few months, I believed them. And I had an identity crisis at that point, because if I'm not a game designer, what am I? I was a game designer my whole life. I was other things too, but I was a game designer throughout it all. But having this distance, you can't heal in the place that hurt you. You have to leave it. Having this distance allowed me to heal and allowed my creativity to come back. And all of a sudden, I was able to make games. So I'm a therapist. I was working on a board game. It started to get good, because it was terrible at first. And I climbed out of it. And now I'm back in a design role. I started at Blizzard in October. And I'm super happy that I was given this opportunity, this second chance. So there are a lot of people who helped me throughout my career. I can't even list all of them. These are just some of the people who I had time to mention. But there were so many more. Nobody does anything alone. That's a lie. Whoever tells you they're a solo dev, they're not a solo dev. There are no solo devs. Nobody does everything alone. It's impossible. Everyone has support, everyone has help. It's just some people are not forward with that information. You can't do anything alone. And without these people, I would not have accomplished anything. So I want to sum it up for you. Don't talk yourself out of trying something because you're intimidated. Because some hills appear as mountains. You can't climb every mountain. Every goal comes with an opportunity cost. So pick your mountains carefully. Don't follow my example. It would have been totally okay for me to do 1/12 of what I did. That would have been enough. One mountain at a time. Sometimes you have to climb down to climb back up. It's okay. Don't beat yourself up about it. I've done that multiple times. And most importantly, you're not alone. So many of us believe that we're alone and they act accordingly. But like-minded people can find each other and help each other in their goals. Just remember this, we're stronger together. Thank you.